This series just keeps on rolling, folks. We're almost there. We got Sacramento Kings out the way. Now we're on to the top 5 all-time San Antonio Spurs. Yes, folks. Now, this one was one of the easier lists to put together because the Spurs' greatest era and a lot of the great players played in my lifetime. So it was pretty easy to put this one together. Did have to do a little bit of research to just keep myself a little bit familiar, look for a few honorable mentions. I pretty much already knew the top 5. I still wanted to check, try to get a few honorable mentions in there. And when I was doing that, one name from that great period of the Spurs dynasty came to mind. That's an honorable mention, which I'll get to that in a second. And this is your first time catching this, though, I do have the link to the playlist both in the description box and the comments, so you can check out the other vids in this series. Without any further ado, let's dive right into it. Starting off with a few honorable mentions. First honorable mention is going to be the French phenom Victor Wembanyama. Now, so far, halfway through his second season, he has taken the league by storm, and he's an absolute force to be reckoned with. However, he's only honorable mention because he's still in the very early stages of his career. But make no mistake about it, one day down the line, you'll certainly see Wemby get to the top 5 greatest Spurs of all time within a few years for sure. But as of now, since he's only halfway through his second season, he's an honorable mention for the time being. I mean, you guys watch the game, you know what I'm talking about. Phenomenal shot blocking. Great 3-point shooting for a center. Excellent all-around game. And that defense is something that's surely lacking in today's game. Which you think as Wemby becomes more popular, that could encourage more players to step up their defensive game. We could slowly start to see more defense come back into the NBA, but that's another subject for another time. But Wemby's only an honorable mention for now because it's only halfway through his second season. Another one is Bruce Bowen from those 2000 Spurs teams. He was a good defensive player. He made the All-NBA defensive team 2004 to 2008 consecutively. Now, he wasn't a great player, but he was great for defense. And he was a good role player for those Spurs championship teams, 2003, 2005, and 2007. Not quite a top 5, but again, another guy certainly worthy of an honorable mention. Another one is Sean Elliott, who was a good 3-point shooter for those 90 Spurs team, a contributing factor to that championship win. He was a 2-time All-Star. Never a great player, but a good player for the Spurs, and certainly at least worthy of an honorable mention. Now, on to the top 5 itself. We're starting off with number 5, Manu Ganobli. Now, Ganobli was the excellent second option in that backcourt alongside Tony Parker from about the 2000s into the 2010s for that Spurs team with Popovich, with Tim Duncan in the power forward role. He's the third best player on that team and a multi-time All-Star in his own right. Now, Manu Ganobli, though, hey, you know him. Tony Parker played a key role in those teams, and Ganobli, hey, nobody forgets about his role in those teams. Now, he wasn't the best player on the team, wasn't the best player in the league, but he was good enough to play his role in those Spurs teams, and he played that role phenomenally, which is why he hits the top 5. Now, moving on to number 4, that is Tony Parker. Now, Tony Parker, there is some debate on whether he's an elite player or a good player with the right team. Now, was he certainly a very good player? Absolutely. But I feel like Tony Parker is one of those guys found the right fit in San Antonio with Coach Pop, Tim Duncan, David Robinson there to mentor him the first couple seasons as well. He had the right system around him, and he played the most of his role. Multi-time All-Star, 3-point specialist, 4-time NBA champion. He's one of a Hall of Famer, and he was the second best player on those Spurs teams and one of the best point guards of his era. No doubt a top 5 for sure, but I only got him at number 4 because I feel like 3, 2, and 1 were better individually. Now I'm going to go with number 3, George Gervin. This might be a bit of a controversial and unpopular decision to put him ahead of Parker and Ganobli, especially ahead of Parker, but I put Gervin ahead because individually he stood out as a more dominant player. While he didn't have the championship runs, George Gervin was a 10-time All-Star throughout his career, and he was the first player He was the player of the first peak run of the Spurs in the 80s. While they didn't make a finals appearance, George Gervin led the way, always kept them in playoff contention, and was a great individual player. But I feel like he individually outshined Tony Parker when you just look at it from an individual player standpoint. Thus why I put him at number 3, with all due respect to Parker. And even the fun fact about Gervin, not only was he a great Spur, but his final season in the NBA, he played on the Bulls, 85-86, and still averaged 16 a game, which had more value. 16 in that era had more value than it does now. Because back then, you didn't always get like 30, 40 points. You didn't get 30, 40-point games as frequently as you do in today's era. But the point is, George Gervin was a good was that first Spurs all-time great. And he was that first one that kind of put them on the map. Then eventually David Robinson. Now segue to number 2, the Admiral, David Robinson. Longtime career Spur, loyal. He, multi-time Defensive Player of the Year. First ballot Hall of Famer, one of the most dominant centers of all time. And he was the key catalyst in keeping the San Antonio Spurs relevant in the 90s. Throughout the entire decade, they were always in the playoff mix, with Robinson leading the way. Throughout Robinson's peak as the number 1 guy, they just couldn't quite get over the hump. But then David Robinson's knee injury happened 96-97, but that turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because during his rehabilitation, the Spurs won the draft lottery, got the number 1 pick in 97, and the Twin Towers formed. And David Robinson, during that later stage of his career, got to win 2 championships. One with Duncan, their second season together, when Robinson was still a presence on offense. Then even in the later stage of his career, when David Robinson individually wasn't as great, he was declining individually, he was still a great mentor for Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ganobli, and still helped mold that dynasty. During his final season there, they won that second championship. Now, individually he declined, but his presence as in leadership was still felt and played a role in that second championship. So David Robinson, during his peak, dominant individual player, one of the all-time great centers. And even in the later stages when he declined, he was still a great leader. And he helped mentor the number 1 guy, the greatest San Antonio Spur of all time, as well as Parker, Ginobili, Bruce Bowen, and some of the other guys that got to go along for the ride. And that number 1 guy is Tim Duncan, considered the greatest power forward of all time. Now, the only weakness he had in his game is he wasn't a great shooter, but he was a phenomenal all-around player. Once David Robinson stepped down, he took over. And he continued the dynasty, 2005, 2007. And then they made it to the finals again, 2013, fell short, but got the revenge in 2014 and won another chip. Tim Duncan, for being there for nearly 20 seasons, winning 5 championships during his tenure, being the lead guy throughout the entire run. Easily the greatest San Antonio Spur of all time. He's the poster boy for that franchise's history, slightly ahead of David Robinson. And for that right there, easily the number 1 guy. Multi-time All-Star, Finals MVP, 5-time champion. When it comes to San Antonio Spurs history, it doesn't get greater than that. So that's my top 5 San Antonio Spurs of all time. You guys comment. Let me know who you have as your top 5. Make sure to also drop a like and subscribe. That's it for Greatest San Antonio Spurs. Coming up next, we're doing the Toronto Raptors, so stay tuned.